What happens when a black man in first class is made to feel as if he doesn't belong to you? You won't believe how a simple exchange turns into a transformative moment. What is life like? This is the story of Marcus Taylor. A man who boarded a first-class flight expecting nothing more than a comfortable journey. Instead, he found himself at the center of an unsettling experience that challenged his dignity and sparked a much larger conversation about prejudice and belonging. Imagine this: a flight that should have been routine, a simple connection from one city to the next, became anything but ordinary. Marcus, dressed impeccably in a tailored suit, was ready for a peaceful journey. However, what awaited him was far from serene. One flight attendant's words and actions turned the quiet cabin into a space of subtle hostility, leaving Marcus with a choice: to endure the discomfort or stand up for himself. It was supposed to be an uneventful flight, the kind that blends into the background of life. Marcus Taylor, a young professional on a brief business trip, boarded the plane and took his seat in first class. He had worked hard for this moment, for the opportunity to enjoy the comfort and luxury that came with his position. His window seat offered a perfect view of the city below, a city he was leaving behind for a much-needed respite. The cabin was quiet, with passengers settling into their seats. Flight attendants moved swiftly through the aisles, preparing for takeoff. Among them was a woman whose polite smile seemed practiced and professional, just another face in the routine of travel. Yet, her demeanor subtly shifted as she approached Marcus. "Good afternoon, sir," she said, her tone courteous but her gaze lingering on him just a moment too long. Marcus returned the smile and greeted her politely. But the moment didn't feel right. Her expression hinted at something beneath the surface, a quiet judgment that was almost imperceptible, but enough to make him pause. What started as a simple exchange soon evolved into a series of interactions that left Marcus questioning his place in a space he had every right to occupy. It wasn't just the flight attendant's words that unsettled him, but the way she said them, the subtle insinuations that suggested he didn't belong. Marcus had entered the flight with hopes of comfort and peace. But now, he found himself at the center of an unwelcome tension. As the plane began to taxi down the runway, Marcus Taylor adjusted his seat and reached for the in-flight magazine. The gentle hum of the engines provided a backdrop for what he thought would be a peaceful journey. Moments later, the same flight attendant who had greeted him earlier approached with a tray of drinks. Her demeanor seemed polite on the surface, but there was something about the way she carried herself that felt off. "Would you like something to drink, sir?" she asked, holding the tray at an angle where the champagne glasses caught the light. "Perhaps a glass of champagne? First-class passengers usually enjoy that." Her voice carried a subtle undertone of amusement, as if she were making a private joke at his expense. Marcus hesitated for a moment, caught off guard by her phrasing. Was there something unusual about her tone? Or was he reading too much into it? Keeping his composure, he replied, "Just water, please." Her response wasn't immediate. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing as if studying him. "Are you sure?" she asked with a faint smile. "Champagne is the favorite up here." Marcus felt a wave of discomfort settle over him. Was this a simple attempt at friendly conversation? Or was there an edge to her words? He nodded firmly and repeated, "Water will be fine." The flight attendant finally moved on. But the moment lingered, leaving Marcus unsettled. As he sipped his water, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that the interaction wasn't as benign as it had seemed. Her gaze, her tone, even the way she lingered, it all felt calculated, as though she was questioning his right to be there. He tried to focus on the book in his lap, But her words played on a loop in his mind, casting a shadow over the flight. The tension only grew from there. About 20 minutes into the flight, the same flight attendant returned. This time, she carried a tray of snacks, pretzels, nuts, and small packages neatly arranged. Marcus looked up from his book, expecting a brief interaction. Instead, she lingered again, her tone overly sweet as she offered him the selection. "No thank you," he said politely, hoping to end the conversation quickly. But she didn't leave. Instead, she leaned in slightly, her expression shifting from polite to something more invasive. "You know," she said with a casualness that felt anything but. "You don't look like the usual people who sit up here." The words hung in the air, heavier than the cabin's pressurized atmosphere. Marcus froze, his mind racing to process what he had just heard. Did she really say that? He felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. "Excuse me?" he asked, his voice steady but tinged with disbelief. "Oh. It's nothing," she replied, waving a hand dismissively. "I just meant that most people up here tend to be a little more refined. But you look nice enough." "Of course." She smiled. But it was a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The comment hit Marcus like a slap. He felt his chest tighten, a mixture of anger and humiliation surging through him. Was she implying he didn't belong? That his presence in first class was some sort of anomaly? He wanted to respond, to call her out for the blatant disrespect. But he chose restraint. His mind was a storm of emotions. But outwardly, he kept his composure. "Is there something wrong with me being up here?" he asked, his tone calm but firm. "Oh no, not at all," she said quickly, though her voice carried an undertone of insincerity. "I was just surprised. That's all." Marcus's pulse quickened as the interaction ended, the flight attendant walking away with the same overly sweet smile. He stared out the window, trying to collect his thoughts. But the encounter replayed in his mind over and over. Her words weren't just awkward, they were deliberate. A thinly veiled attempt to question his presence in a space he had every right to occupy. The tension reached its peak when the flight attendant returned once more. This time without a tray or refreshments. She stood in front of Marcus, her arms folded and a faint smirk on her lips. "Is everything all right, sir?" she asked, her voice laced with mockery. "Yes. Everything's fine," Marcus replied curtly, meeting her gaze with unwavering steadiness. She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial tone. "I just wanted to make sure you were comfortable. You know, we're all about making our first-class passengers feel at ease. But sometimes, people don't quite belong in certain places. Do they?" The insinuation was no longer subtle, it was blatant. Marcus felt his heart pound, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. He had tried to stay calm, to rise above the subtle jabs. But this was too much. The air around him felt stifling, and the once luxurious seat now felt like a trap. Taking a deep breath, he decided he had endured enough. "I think I've had enough," he said firmly, standing up and gathering his belongings. The flight attendant's eyes widened, surprised by his reaction. But she didn't stop him. Marcus moved down the aisle, settling into an empty seat in the middle section. The stares of the other passengers burned into his back. But he didn't care. He couldn't stay in that space any longer. Not when his dignity had been so blatantly disregarded. As he sat down in his new seat, Marcus felt a mix of relief and anger. He had removed himself from the immediate situation. But the weight of what had happened remained. The flight attendant's words had cut deep, exposing an undercurrent of prejudice that was both infuriating and deeply hurtful. Marcus knew this wasn't just about one flight. It was about something much larger, a systemic issue that so many faced but few had the courage to confront. And as the plane flew on, Marcus resolved that this moment wouldn't define him. But it would push him to demand better, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. The moment Marcus Taylor decided he had endured enough, a new sense of clarity washed over him. He had spent most of the flight trying to rationalize the flight attendant's words, telling himself it might be a misunderstanding or an isolated incident. But her final remark, "Sometimes people don't quite belong in certain places, do they?" was the breaking point. Taking a deep breath, Marcus unclasped his seatbelt and stood up. His movements calm but deliberate. "I think I've had enough," he said. His voice firm yet steady, the restraint in his tone masking the storm brewing within. He began gathering his belongings, his hands trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the surge of emotions coursing through him: anger, frustration, and a deep sense of injustice. Other passengers in first class glanced his way. Their curiosity piqued, but their faces unreadable. The flight attendant, momentarily stunned by his response, said nothing. Her polite facade cracked ever so slightly, revealing a flicker of surprise. Without another word, Marcus walked down the aisle toward the economy section. He spotted an empty seat in the middle section and sat down, breathing deeply to steady his thoughts. He had sacrificed the comfort he had paid for. But in doing so, he preserved something far more important: his dignity. As he settled into his new seat, Marcus glanced back toward the first-class cabin. The flight attendant avoided his gaze. Her movements hurried and stiff. The weight of the interaction still pressed heavily on him. But he knew he had made the right choice. Removing himself from the hostile environment was not an act of defeat, it was a statement. He wouldn't let her treatment define him. And he refused to stoop to her level. As the plane continued its journey, Marcus tried to focus on anything but the tension that had unfolded. He opened the book he had brought, but the words blurred as his mind replayed the events in vivid detail. He felt exhausted, not just from the confrontation but from the years of subtle and overt judgments he had experienced before this moment. Suddenly, he felt a light tap on his shoulder. He turned to see a middle-aged white woman standing beside him, her expression serious but kind. She looked vaguely familiar, and it took him a moment to realize she had been seated in first class, directly behind him. "Excuse me," she said softly, glancing around to ensure no one else was listening. "I just wanted to say, I saw what happened up there. I don't know if you realized, but I was sitting right behind you the whole time." Marcus blinked, his confusion evident. "You saw?" he asked cautiously. The woman nodded, her voice growing more resolute. "Yes, I did. And I just want to say I'm so sorry. What that flight attendant did was unacceptable. It was racist and unprofessional. Plain and simple." Her words caught Marcus off guard. He had expected to feel alone in his frustration, isolated in his experience. Yet here was someone he didn't even know validating what he had felt. "I appreciate you saying that," Marcus said, his voice quieter now, the weight of the moment settling in. But the woman wasn't finished. "This isn't just about saying I'm sorry," she continued. "This needs to be addressed. People like her can't get away with treating others like that. I'm an attorney, and I've dealt with cases like this before. If you're willing, I'd like to help you take action. Her words carried a quiet conviction. And Marcus felt a glimmer of something he hadn't expected: hope. For so long, he had carried the burden of these moments alone, enduring them silently. Now, for the first time, someone was offering not just words of comfort, but tangible support. This kind of behavior doesn't just go away, she added. It's systemic. And it needs to be called out whenever it happens. You don't have to go through this alone. Marcus felt a mix of emotions: gratitude, relief, and a renewed sense of determination. He didn't know what would come next. But he knew one thing for certain: he wouldn't let this moment be swept under the rug. Thank you, he said, meeting her gaze. That means more than you know. The woman gave a small, reassuring smile and took out her phone. Let's exchange contact information. I'll make sure this gets the attention it deserves. As she walked back to her seat, Marcus felt a shift within himself. The weight of the encounter hadn't disappeared. But now it felt shared, less isolating, less overwhelming. The road ahead would likely be challenging. But for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he was walking it alone. After the flight, Marcus Taylor replayed the events in his mind, unsure of what his next steps should be. Fortunately, the attorney, who introduced herself as Rebecca Morrison, was already making moves to address the situation. As soon as the plane landed, Rebecca contacted the airline's customer service to report the incident. Her tone was firm, and her message was clear: the flight attendant's behavior was unacceptable and required immediate attention. Within 48 hours, Rebecca had filed an official complaint on Marcus's behalf, demanding an internal investigation. The airline's initial response was lackluster: a standard apology email that expressed regret over the misunderstanding, but failed to address the racial undertones of the flight attendant's actions. They assured Marcus that internal steps were being taken to prevent future occurrences, but provided no specific details. For Marcus, this response was deeply unsatisfying. The airline's vague assurances felt like an attempt to sweep the incident under the rug, to pacify him without addressing the root of the problem. But with Rebecca's guidance, Marcus refused to let the matter rest. Rebecca escalated the issue by reaching out to key executives within the airline, including their legal and public relations teams. She emphasized that the incident was not just a personal grievance but a systemic failure to ensure a safe and respectful environment for all passengers. In her communications, she made it clear that if the airline did not take meaningful action, they would face public and potentially legal consequences. Behind the scenes, the airline began to feel the pressure. Internally, they suspended the flight attendant pending the investigation. However, this move seemed more like a defensive tactic to protect their reputation rather than a genuine attempt to address the issue. Marcus, with Rebecca's support, remained resolute. He refused to accept a token apology or superficial changes. Rebecca's persistence paid off when the airline agreed to meet with Marcus and discuss the matter in detail. During the meeting, Marcus, supported by Rebecca, outlined the emotional toll of the incident and the broader implications of such behavior. He emphasized that this was not just about his experience but about ensuring that no one else would endure the same treatment. The airline's legal team apologized profusely, but Marcus could see through their carefully worded statements. They were more concerned with avoiding a public relations disaster than genuinely addressing the issue. Marcus and Rebecca pushed for tangible actions, mandatory diversity and inclusion training for all employees, a public acknowledgement of the incident, and a commitment to addressing systemic bias within the company. Though the airline hesitated at first, The growing pressure from Marcus and Rebecca made it clear that this was not an issue they could ignore. While Rebecca worked on the legal side, Marcus's story began to gain traction in an unexpected way. A fellow passenger on the flight had posted a detailed account of the incident on social media, describing the flight attendant's behavior and Marcus's dignified response. The post went viral, drawing thousands of comments and shares within hours. Under the hashtag #NotYourSeat, people began sharing their own stories of discrimination and prejudice. The hashtag, simple yet powerful, encapsulated the frustration of being judged for one's appearance rather than their right to occupy a space. Marcus was initially hesitant about the attention. He hadn't sought to become a public figure or a symbol of change. But as the movement grew, he realized the impact his story was having. Messages flooded in from people around the world, some sharing similar experiences, others offering words of support. The public outcry forced the airline into the spotlight. News outlets picked up the story, and it became a trending topic on multiple platforms. The airline's PR team scrambled to control the narrative, issuing a public statement acknowledging the incident and promising a thorough investigation. But the public wasn't satisfied with vague promises. Social media users called for accountability, demanding to know what actions the airline would take to prevent such incidents in the future. The pressure mounted as activists and influencers joined the conversation, amplifying the hashtag and pushing for systemic change. The viral nature of the story also brought to light other instances of discrimination within the airline industry. Passengers from various backgrounds began sharing stories of being mistreated or judged unfairly by airline staff. What started as Marcus's individual experience had sparked a much larger conversation about bias and inequality in air travel and beyond. The #NotYourSeat movement grew into more than just a critique of one airline. It became a rallying cry for change in spaces where people of color and marginalized groups had been made to feel unwelcome. The conversation extended to broader issues of systemic racism, implicit bias, and the need for inclusive training in customer-facing industries. The airline, now under intense scrutiny, was forced to take more significant actions. They announced a comprehensive review of their policies and procedures, as well as the implementation of mandatory diversity and inclusion training for all employees. Additionally, they promised to establish an independent committee to handle complaints of discrimination and bias. For Marcus, the public response was overwhelming. While he appreciated the support, he also became a target for those resistant to change. Anonymous messages and online threats reminded him of the backlash that often accompanies speaking out against systemic issues. Yet, despite the challenges, Marcus remained committed to the cause. The incident had opened his eyes to the power of collective voices. What had started as a deeply personal and painful experience had grown into a movement that resonated with countless others. Through his courage and Rebecca's relentless advocacy, Marcus had sparked a conversation that couldn't be ignored. As the public continued to demand more from the airline and other industries, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. He hadn't chosen to become a symbol of change, but he had embraced the responsibility that came with it. The #NotYourSeat movement was proof that even the smallest acts of resistance, standing up, speaking out, refusing to back down, could ignite a fire that challenged the status quo. Under mounting public pressure and the momentum of the #NotYourSeat movement, the airline was forced to take concrete action. After a thorough investigation, they announced the immediate suspension of the flight attendant involved in the incident. While this step was a start, it was clear that deeper changes were needed to address the systemic issues revealed by Marcus Taylor's story. The airline committed to implementing mandatory diversity, equity, and inclusion training for all employees, starting with their flight crews and customer service teams. This training aimed to address unconscious bias, promote empathy, and reinforce the importance of treating every passenger with respect and dignity. Additionally, the airline pledged to create a new, independent oversight committee to handle complaints of discrimination and harassment, ensuring such incidents were taken seriously and addressed promptly. Publicly, the company acknowledged their shortcomings, expressing regret not just for Marcus's experience but for failing to foster an inclusive environment. These actions, though necessary, were met with cautious optimism. Marcus, alongside his attorney Rebecca Morrison, remained vigilant, emphasizing that while the airline's steps were a start, true change would require consistent effort and accountability. For Marcus, the actions were not just about his case, they were about setting a precedent to protect others from enduring similar injustices. Marcus Taylor's story resonated far beyond the confines of a single flight. It became a catalyst for conversations about bias, prejudice, and the courage to confront injustice. His experience highlighted a painful truth: discrimination often hides behind polite smiles and subtle words. But its impact is deeply felt by those who endure it. This incident serves as a powerful reminder of the importance of standing up against discrimination, even when it's uncomfortable or risky. Marcus could have chosen to remain silent, to brush off the flight attendant's remarks as an isolated incident. But by speaking out and refusing to accept less than the respect he deserved, he challenged not just the individual who wronged him but the system that enabled such behavior. For viewers, Marcus's story offers a lesson in the strength of collective voices. The rise of the #NotYourSeat movement demonstrated how sharing experiences and supporting one another can amplify the call for change. It also underscores the need for individuals to use their platforms, no matter how small, to demand accountability and fairness in every space they occupy. This story is about more than one man, it's about all of us. It's a reminder that the fight against discrimination requires persistence and solidarity. We cannot allow prejudice to go unchallenged. Whether it's in the workplace, on an airplane, or in everyday life. As Marcus reflects on his journey, he acknowledges that the road to change is long and often difficult. But he also believes in the power of progress and the resilience of people to demand better. His story is proof that even in moments of vulnerability, there is strength in speaking up. To everyone watching, Marcus's message is clear. Speak out. Demand respect. Together, we can create a future where everyone belongs. The fight against discrimination is not just about policies or training, it's about creating a world where every person feels seen, valued, and respected. Ending with a call to action, Marcus encourages viewers to take the lessons of his story into their own lives. If you've ever felt overlooked, marginalized, or made to feel less than, know this: your voice matters. Stand up for what's right. Speak out when you see injustice. And never let anyone make you feel like you don't belong. Together, we can create a better future for everyone.